President Joe Biden is dealing with the fallout of two ongoing crises in America, the COVID-19 pandemic and systemic racism. The federal government brought the use of one vaccine to a sudden halt this week over safety concerns. And as the trial of Derek Chauvin plays out, we saw another death of a black man at the hands of a police officer. Daunte Wright was killed Sunday just a few miles away from the spot where George Floyd died last year. There's a lot to get to tonight, but first, let's cover the historic foreign policy moves by President Biden this week. On Wednesday, he announced the end of the longest war in American history. All remaining American troops will be out of Afghanistan by September 11th, 2021, the 20-year anniversary of the 9/11 attacks.
We went to Afghanistan because of a horrific attack that happened 20 years ago. That cannot explain why we should remain there in 2021.
And Afghanistan's not the only global issue confronting the president. Mr. Biden issued new sanctions against Russia yesterday, and today he held his first in-person bilateral meeting with the Prime Minister of Japan. So what do these moves tell us about Mr. Biden's approach to foreign policy, and what does it all mean for America's global standing? Well, joining us tonight to talk about all of it are four top Washington reporters. Eugene Daniels, White House correspondent for Politico and co-author of the Politico Playbook, and Gearan, White House correspondent for the Washington Post. Kasie Hunt, Capitol Hill correspondent for NBC News and host of MSNBC's Way Too Early, and Wesley Lowery, correspondent for 60 Minutes Plus and my CBS News colleague. Welcome to all of you. And let's start with you. So big picture, what did the foreign policy moves made by this president this week on Afghanistan, on Russia, on China tell us about the Biden doctrine and how he plans to handle foreign affairs as president?
Nancy, I think all of those things have in common that they are an attempt by the president to redirect American foreign policy resources toward Asia and toward China in particular. In Afghanistan, his argument is specifically tied to China. He said on Wednesday that it doesn't make sense for the United States to continue to spend the amount of money and diplomatic effort and all kinds of other effort that goes with supporting the 20-year mission and 20-year war in Afghanistan for what essentially is an outdated and now increasingly irrelevant conflict. He said that everything we went to Afghanistan can do, we've either already done or can accomplish in other ways. The terrorist threat we went there to vanquish has changed, and he said it can be managed in other ways. He really didn't address the stability of the Afghan government and whether or not there'll be a peace deal with the Taliban going forward. That is the U.S. hope, but he was firm in saying that it is really the U.S. has to stick to its knitting here. It has to go and spend its time and energy where the priorities really are, which in his view is Asia. Obviously, that same argument is part of why the Japanese Prime Minister was here today. The Biden administration is quite pleased with the stronger tone that this Japanese administration is taking toward China. They want to link arms with the strongest U.S. ally in Asia and say not only will going forward, will the United States not give China a free pass in its own neighborhood, but they will also, have a whole new set of Asian partners, revitalized Asian alliances that, in the Biden view, were let go fallow under Trump.
And yet there are so many unknowns about the future of Afghanistan. Eugene, it wasn't that long ago that President Biden himself was saying that it might be a good idea to keep a residual force in Afghanistan. We know some of his Pentagon advisors felt the same way. So why this reversal?
Absolutely. And talked about this a little bit, but part of what has changed is that domestically, the administration feels there are even more problems than modern presidents have had to deal with. And the threats in the foreign policy space are even more complicated. They're evolving. Like Ann said, a rising China, these tensions with Russia, they are taking precedence over what's happening in Afghanistan. The Biden administration is betting that all of that money and all of that attention it could use is better used there. And they're also banking on more diplomacy. He talked about that as well, even though the Taliban have already been reluctant or basically just flat out refused to deal with the government. And so now they have even less incentive, experts say, to negotiate with the U.S. troops because we're about to leave. You also have a country that's just tired of being over there. 20 years in that country, they've heard multiple promises of, getting rid of the forever wars from different presidents, this being one of them. And so there's a lot of pressure from the American people for us to leave there. But it's very risky. His own intel chiefs published this threat assessment saying that the government there would struggle to hold the Taliban at bay if the coalition withdrew. His own CIA chief in front of Congress this week said our ability to collect information and act on threats would diminish. So if there is this vacuum that we've seen in Iraq that occurs, it's going to be owned by this administration because pulling out is not going to magically stabilize the region there. And so it's risky for Biden here.
Right. And, it's interesting that you talk about war fatigue. Kasie, it seemed to me this week that the pushback on the president's decision was kind of muted. I mean, yes, we saw the perfunctory statements from lawmakers who think that the U.S. should remain in Afghanistan, but it wasn't as ferocious as what we saw last year when President Trump initially said that he wanted to remove troops.
That's right, Nancy, and I think it reflects some of the general exhaustion around this that you heard in President Biden's voice when he gave that address from the very same place where former President George W. Bush had announced that we were going in the first place. This has been our longest war, and the partisan lines on this are not as clear-cut as perhaps they once were either. I mean, you certainly had hawks, Republicans like Mitch McConnell and Marco Rubio, who said this was a bad idea, but you also had Democrats, specifically the two Democratic senators from New Hampshire, raising some concerns about it. You also had Republicans like Senator Rand Paul and some others say, yeah, you know what, actually it's a better idea that we go ahead and leave. So this isn't something that is completely clear-cut. And one thing I did hear over and over again as I spoke with sources this week on the Hill, especially those with ties to the military, whether those who served or those who have a large military presence in their states and districts, was that we should take a moment to stop and think about what this does mean to the troops on the ground, because there are so many Americans who have spilled blood, sweat, tears in Afghanistan, and so many families back at home who've borne the burden of this war for so long. And it's a relatively small group of our population, especially compared to past conflicts that really convulsed many more families and were more widely felt among all of us. So I think that's also been something that's on the minds of at least some of these lawmakers that I've been talking to, frankly, in both parties.
Right. The tens of thousands of injuries from this war alone. Wesley, I want to go back to something that Eugene talked about, the political risks and the rewards. I mean, obviously, there is a political upside for this president if he is the one who is finally able to end this long war. On the other hand, if Afghanistan sinks into a civil war, or if the Taliban is resurgent, as many fear, what are the political risks for him there?
Well, there certainly are risks, and as a general rule, you don't want to generalize too much, but Democrats have a particular vulnerability with Republicans who have spent years branding themselves as the supporters of the military, as the stronger of the two parties as it relates to those types of things. And so a Democrat making such a decision, were it to blow up on the back end, there could be some real blowback for President Biden. But that said, I think one of the key things here, and this is what I think President Biden is betting on in making this decision, is that for the average American, the people who are going to vote next year to decide who controls Congress, people who are going to vote in 3 years to decide if President Biden, if he runs again, gets another term, he's betting that they see more eminent and more urgent threats in their lives, be it the pandemic, be it the economy because of the pandemic, even if it's immigration, climate change, these issues of race we're talking about. Unlike some past presidents, where among the electorate, this idea of terror attacks was something that was an extremely high concern for so many Americans, that there's a unique moment we're in, where perhaps for the first time post 9/11, we're not seeing this fear of terrorism ranking among the top concerns of the Americans, in part because there's this massive global pandemic that has to rank pretty high for all of us.
Right, such a good point. And I want to turn to Russia and this very interesting sort of carrot and stick approach that President Biden took this week with President Putin on one hand, issuing new sanctions, expelling Russian diplomats, but then on the other hand saying he doesn't want to escalate tensions and he actually wants to sit down and have a one-on-one meeting with President Putin this summer. What do you make of the strategy here?
Well, I make of it that the president doesn't want another distraction. He doesn't want one more fight on his hands, and he's going to have to contend with Vladimir Putin on a number of fronts for as long as he's president. He doesn't want to start out his presidency on the worst possible footing he can. So yes, I think your framing of carrot and stick is exactly right. He ran saying that he wouldn't let Russia go unpunished. So he really had to follow through certainly on the election interference sanctions. That was a big one. But he also wanted to make sure that it was clear that he's inviting Putin to have a different kind of relationship going forward, at the very least not to have the worst one that they could strike right from the get-go. And remember, too, that Putin is invited to the climate summit that the president is holding next week, which is really his big marquee event, his first big heavy lift on the world stage. He doesn't want that to blow up. Certainly, he doesn't want Putin to get credit or blame, or get credit while he gets the blame. If it blows up, he'd like to have that go well. But certainly he's getting a lot of criticism that he pulled some punches with the way he handled Russia this week.
Right, and Russia now retaliating with some sanctions, threatened sanctions of his own. Kasie, I want to ask you about this controversy that just bubbled up today. Progressives furious after the White House announced that it would not be allowing more refugees into this country after all, that it was going to stick, at least for now, to this historically low cap that was set by the Trump administration. Now, after a few hours of blowback, it looks like they're reversing that. What exactly is going on here?
Nancy, this is an incredibly difficult issue for the White House because obviously the pictures, what we've seen on the southern border, the number of unaccompanied children coming has turned into a crisis in terms of trying to figure out how to care for all of them, especially in the midst of a global pandemic. And it's an issue that Republicans have zeroed in on as a potential place to put political pressure on President Biden. And so this did come out earlier in the day that they were going to leave this cap essentially where it was, and there was immediate backlash from progressives like Pramila Jayapal, Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, also from Senator Dick Durbin, who had a line saying, President Joe, say it ain't so. He's been an immigrant advocate for a long time. They seem to have be a bit back on their heels. And since this all unfolded, the press secretary, Jen Psaki, has said that there is some confusion about this, that we may learn more about it later on in the month. But it seems clear the White House is nervous about giving Republicans any more opportunities on this, even though during the campaign, this was one of those things that Joe Biden, now President Biden, has explicitly cast as being about American values. And I think that's part of why the feelings around this are so raw.
Right, and clearly very predictable backlash here.